Vitascha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shivashakanvitangscha He Krishna Karana Sindhu Dinabando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Angsho Bhagavatosmyam Sadada Sosmi Sarvata Tat Kripa Bhikshako Nityat Tat Preshta Sat Karomi Sam Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Shall we? Shall we begin? All right, thank you so much. Hare Krishna, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, wherever you are. It's a wonderful morning, wonderful warm morning where I am, and we are very happy. So let us begin with another verse from the beautiful Srimad Bhagavatam. We place our hands together and say, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We have proceeded in our studies of the Bhagavatam to the 9th canto, the 10th chapter, and we're reading the 3rd verse. This chapter and the next chapter is about the next famous person in the family tree of Amshuman and the Raghu dynasty. It is none other than the supreme person in the form of the king, Lord Rama, Lord Ramachandra. This is the 3rd verse. Tasyanu charitam rajan rishibis tattvadarshibhi shrutam hi varanitam bhuri tvaya sita pater muhu. Srila Prabhupada's translation. O King Parikshit, the transcendental activities of Lord Ramachandra have been described by great saintly persons who have seen the truth, because you have heard again and again about Lord Ramachandra, the husband of Mother Sita. I shall describe these activities only in brief. Please listen. Now, Srila Prabhupada gives his purport here, and it's a very interesting purport, because if you or I were to give a purport to this verse, we'd probably start talking about the Ramayana, which I will do, or about Mother Sita, or something like this. But immediately Prabhupada takes issue with those who would challenge the reality of Lord Ramachandra. Not only the position of Lord Ramachandra as an avatar of Vishnu, but his very right to exist. And there were such people with very advanced academic degrees in the time when Prabhupada was writing these commentaries. So he goes immediately to forewarn us about listening to their unqualified opinions. So he says in the purport, modern Rakshasas, posing as educationally advanced merely because they have doctorates, have tried to prove that Lord Ramachandra is not the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but an ordinary person. But those who are learned and spiritually advanced will never accept such notions. They will accept the descriptions of Lord Ramachandra and his activities only as presented by Tattvadarshis, those who know the absolute truth. In Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, verse 34, very famous verse here, the Supreme Personality of Godhead advises, Tadvadi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshana. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized soul can impart knowledge unto you because he has seen the truth. Unless one is Tattvadarshi, in complete knowledge of the absolute truth, one cannot describe the activities of the personality of Godhead. Therefore, although there are many so-called Ramayans or histories of Lord Ramachandra's activities, some of them are not actually authoritative. Sometimes Lord Ramachandra's activities are described in terms of one's own imaginations, speculations, or material sentiments. But the characteristics of Lord Ramachandra should not be handled as something imaginary. While describing the history of Lord Ramachandra, Shukadeva Goswami told Maharaj Parikshit, "You've already heard about the activities of Lord Ramachandra. Apparently, therefore, 5,000 years ago, there were many Ramayans or histories of Lord Ramachandra's activities, and there are many still. But we must select only those books written by Tattvadarshis, Jnaninas Tattvadarshana, not the books of so-called scholars who claim knowledge only on the basis of a doctorate." This is a warning by Shukadeva Goswami. Rishibis Tattvadarshibhi. Although the Ramayana, composed by Valmiki, is a huge literature, the same activities are summarized here by Shukadeva Goswami in a few verses. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshura Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Dear devotees, thank you for allowing me yet again to be with you in the Bhakti Center community and to speak something from the Bhagavatam. So Prabhupada begins here that, let's just have a look at the Ramayana. The Ramayana is bigger than the Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is 18,000 verses, which is, you know what a Srimad Bhagavatam on your shelf looks like, with the purports, translations, Sanskrit, word for word. It takes up an entire shelf on your bookshelf. I hope you do all have the Srimad Bhagavatam at home. If not, get one immediately. Prabhupada's life work was the Srimad Bhagavatam, and everything is in it, including the Ramayana. But the Ramayana is 24,000 verses compared to the 18,000 of the Srimad Bhagavatam, written by Valmiki. It is the story of Rama, Ayana. Ayana means the journey. Rama means the Supreme Person. Ramayana, the journey of the Supreme Person. So it's 24,000 verses divided into 7 divisions and about 500 chapters. So there's there's a lot there. An amazing amount of stories within stories. We find that the Ramayana has been used as the one book upon which the entire culture, meaning the way that different people interact with each other, how fathers, mothers bring up their children, how justice is administered, how leadership is qualified. In many different countries, the Ramayana is the bedrock of that, just like in our Western civilizations, you could say to a certain extent that the Bible and its commandments and its understanding of God has formed the foundation of what we call our civilization. So if you go to Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, many other places, you will find that Ramayana is there as a foundational document of how people should be. And it's very simple in its essence. It's that we should be God conscious, we should be peaceful, we should help each other, and we should form communities which are held together by a framework of compassionate justice and mutual service. And we should try to develop knowledge and love of the instructions of God. So this is all contained in the Ramayana in the form of a narrative which takes us through these 7 divisions or 7 khandas. The Balakanda is the description of the appearance of Lord Ram, and the Ayodhya section is about the wonderful city in which he and his brothers, father and mother and stepmothers, were living in, and the intrigues that eventually saw him banished to the forest along with his wife, young wife Sita. The Aranyakanda, what happened to them in the forest. Kishkinda, when they met the Sugriva, the leader of a tribe of monkey men in the forest. And Hanuman enters the story at that point, as does Vali, who was the opponent to Sugriva, who stole his kingdom and his wife. So Lord Ram helps Sugriva, and then Sugriva helps Ram by commissioning many different jungle inhabitants to assist Ram in his search for his wife Sita, who's now been stolen. Sundarakanda, when Hanuman goes to find Sita and partially destroys the kingdom, the capital city of Ravana, who is the anti-hero of the story of the Ramayana. And a big battle follows, and then the reign of Ram is reestablished. So these are the different divisions. But all of that, all 24,000 verses of the Ramayana, is pretty much summarized in just one verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the next verse, 9, 10, 4. And pretty much you get the whole story. Although ultimately in the Bhagavatam we have 2 chapters dedicated to Ram. But in this verse, the person narrating all the knowledge that needs to be known before someone dies, namely the Srimad Bhagavatam, Shukadeva Goswami, the young boy sage, he says, look, you've probably heard this story many times before, so I'm not going to repeat it. You know the story so well. It was, of course, because Parikshit, not only was he a person living in Vedic culture in which there was multiple recitations of Ramayana, but also he was a king, and he would have heard about Ramayana because that's what kings listen to. It's how you got to govern as a king was on the basis of Ram Raja, the reign of Ram. In other words, the reign of Lord Ramachandra was the perfect standard to model your own kingship upon. So Shukadeva Goswami said, look, I'm not going to tell you the whole story again. You know the story, but let's just focus on a few aspects. The Ramayana belongs to a category of literature known as itihasa. Iti means thus, hasa means it happened. Itihasa, thus it happened. So it's history. It means it actually happened. It's not a fairy story or what the modern anthropologists call mythology. In other words, that it performs a perfectly valid psychological function, but psychological function and history are 2 different things. If I tell you a story about Captain America or Superman saving people from fires in big buildings in New York City, it performs a psychological function, or is something done to entertain people. But don't go thinking that there was actually a Superman or there was actually a Captain America. So some people have focused on the Ramayana and said, well, look, obviously it performs it's a cultural phenomenon, it's psychological, it's good for psychological health to think that God would come and aid the people of the world. But don't go thinking that it's true. And the reason we cannot believe that it's true is because, look, all these stories, we can't possibly believe them, because whilst they contain some elements that we witnessed personally, there's many elements of those stories that we've not witnessed personally, so how can we possibly believe them? And so one of the elements in the stories, of course, Ravana, he's the anti-hero, he's the demonic force which must be overcome by the avatar of Vishnu. So he's known as a Rakshasa. Rakshasa means a man-eater, people who eat another human being. And sometimes even that is enough to make us feel that, well, that can't possibly be true. How can it possibly be that there can ever be a human being who can eat another human being? But even in my life, I met someone who was a yogi, a yoga practitioner. He was more than 80 years old, but he came from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where he was telling stories of people that he knew were cannibals. They were man-eaters. So such things still exist. He wasn't a Rakshasa himself, but he knew of them. And the practice of eating your enemy, or eating your opponent, is not such a far-fetched thing. But it may not have been in your particular experience. So because you've never experienced such persons or such activities, you may think to yourself, well, I have never seen that, therefore how can it exist? And we tend to think what is known as Atmaponyena Jagat, that as I am, so the rest of the world is. But this is a mental projection from you onto the world. And what the Ramayana and many similar books like the Srimad Bhagavatam do is to really call us out on our mental projection and say, just because you would like this to be true, just because you cannot believe it, does not mean it is not true. It does not take place. So Prabhupada, in the beginning of this purport, he's doing the same thing. He's calling out these. He goes straight for the jugular, doesn't he? He calls them modern Rakshasas. So these are people who Prabhupada knew. I guess they were very prevalent in the, well, not that they're not prevalent now, but in the 60s and the 70s, when Prabhupada was translating the Srimad Bhagavatam, there were men, usually men in India, holding doctorates, propounding that Lord Ramachandra never existed, or if he did exist, he was a king, and he didn't do all the fabulous things that he's credited with doing. So immediately Prabhupada calls them out, and he says that they are Rakshasas, because just as an ordinary Rakshasa, a cannibal, eats another person's flesh, so men who speak in this way, they eat the minds of other vulnerable men that they conquer through their apparent intelligence. We kowtow, as he says, we kowtow, we bow down to those who have greater intelligence than ourselves. The whole world is running on a pecking order. My grandchildren are over here at the moment from New Jersey, spending some time in England as Namras's and Tulsi's children. And the other day we took them to feed some ducks in the local duck pond. And immediately we began to offer food to some of the birds. The pecking order came out. The pecking order is a real thing. It's if I'm a bigger bird than you, if I'm a swan, I get to peck you. If you're a big duck, you get to peck a smaller duck. If you're a smaller duck, you get to peck a chick. And so in this way, there was immediately a hierarchical system of who could peck who. This is a so-called pecking order. Now, there's a pecking order in human society also. And it usually goes with those who are academically qualified at the top. If someone is on TV or radio or magazine, they're called as an expert. We call in a doctor, professor of this or professor of that. And immediately a pecking order is set up by such display of knowledge. This person knows, and I am on the receiving end of his or her knowledge. I do not know. And what this does, it makes us either relegate everything we think we know to a lower position in obeisance, actually, intellectual obeisance to our betters. So there's an intellectual pecking order, and we find our place somewhere in it. But we do so at our great peril. Prabhupada says here that actually we should be very much aware that you may know more. There was one of our and nowhere is there more of a pecking order in religion and spirituality. This is where the dynamic of empowerment and disempowerment can sometimes be seen. Religious behavior calls upon the believer or the worshipper to accept the existence of God, the supremely powerful, and the fallen sinner, who's the supremely disempowered, and thereby sets up a gulf of disempowerment. And anyone who is somewhere in that chain of from powerful to disempowered becomes very powerful to you who are disempowered. So therefore, ministers and munis and vicars and pastors and imams and rabbis, they often hold great power over us because they speak on behalf of God. Now, there's nothing wrong in that, except when they don't speak on behalf of God, which is the real problem. We need people speaking on behalf of God, but we need people who are tattvadarshis, those who have actually seen the truth. Religious tendency is that everybody bows or genuflects or has some physical display of humility towards those who are above them, and there's a type of dress by which one is singled out as a member of the religious hierarchy. So all that is good because we do need to inculcate some sense of awe and some sense of the representative of God having power. But we disempower ourselves when we don't have the correct source of wisdom in front of us. So all of this, Prabhupada, he tries to wipe away. He tries to say, well, all of this is, these people can eat you. They can eat you intellectually. They can eat your mind by disempowering you, thinking, bringing you to the point that I know nothing. When actually, the business of Krishna consciousness is to empower people, to actually give them the power that they have not had, and reestablish them in the power of the soul. If the soul is more brilliant than many millions of suns rising up in the sky at one time, if that's really truly us, then what are we doing so disempowered? So those that take our power away, pretty much they are Rakshasas. But it is everybody's business to set up a pecking order with you at the bottom. So what are you going to do? You have to fight back. So this business of fighting back, this is the real internal Krishna consciousness. Now in Prabhupada's own sphere of activity in the latter part of the last century, there were different forces in play, certainly in India, which wanted to deliberately reduce the stature of Lord Ramachandra to merely being a historical and cultural hero. By this time, there was another academic-inspired cultural viewpoint that all of this, what we now know as Hinduism, did not originate in India, but had come in from somewhere in the steppes, somewhere in Germany, somewhere in Asia, Central Asia. And along with Central Asia had come Sanskrit, and basically everything that you could point to in Indian history that was of any use to human society did not come from India. And it's no surprise to learn that this theory was taught principally by the first Indologists to really seriously study Indian history in an academic way, who came from England and Germany. So no prizes for guessing where the theory that all this wonderful knowledge came from outside India actually came from. But this was taught in the universities, and if you wanted an education in India for at least 200 years, you had to go to a British or European organized place of education. So that this theory was a permanent part of the way Hindus looked at themselves, the way Indians looked at themselves. So it led to a sort of inferiority complex where certain types of Indians who were closer physically, geographically, to the incursion of this Sanskritic culture, namely North India, were superior, being closer to the source than others. So this led to a sort of divide in India, which still goes on to the present day, called the Aryan Dravidian divide, meaning that there's really two Indias. There's a northern Aryan one, which was based on the Sanskrit language, and a Tamil Dravidian based on the Tamil language, which was the southern. And this idea was shamelessly exploited by politicians who really wished to see their own group rise in power. It's usually the wish of a politician to see a country divided in some way, because division means that there's more of an opportunity for you to have a powerful position in a divided country than there is in a united country. Because a united country calls together all the talent of a country, where half a country, there's double the opportunities for all politicians. So this was going on. So Lord Rama was seen as an opponent of the Dravidian or Tamilian Ravana. It was taken at that level. The Rama's from the north, Ayodhya, and Ravana, he's our man, he's from the south. And this has gone on to the present day, that Lord Ram is Vishnu and Lord Ravana was worshipping Shiva. So this division was not only a geographical, political, but also a sort of division according to Vishnu and Shiva. Unfortunately, the world, whether ancient or modern, needs no impetus to divide. The modes of nature are doing that at every single moment. The general tendency is that we want to divide and then the two parties that have divided from the one party, then they divide. An infinite division leads us to a universe in which we are the sole visionary. Only we see things as they are. So some people were worshipping worshipping Ravan, and they set themselves up as opponents to Ram, since Ram killed Ravan in the battlefield. Then there were other elements on language basis. Srila Prabhupada said that in 1948, the national language of India all over the country should have been Sanskrit, and this would have united the country. However, those in the north won out, or politicians won out, and the national language became Hindi. The language of the politicians became Hindi, with a secondary language of English. So then people in the south, they said, well, we're not speaking Hindi. We have no interest in Hindi. We'll just speak English. And so they became very much interested in Shakespeare and English language and poetry and classical writers, in opposition to the northerners, where Hindi was dominant. So there was an anti-Hindi agitation as well. So for all these different reasons, by the time we get to the 1970s, we find many so-called intellectuals condemning the idea, even the idea that Ram should be in any way a kind of hero for Hinduism itself, which is, very strange, isn't it? But these are all undercurrents. And in our Krishna consciousness movement, we're trying also to establish a current of thought. And the general current of thought has many opponents in the world today. Prabhupada took them on and used a great deal of his speaking time, his conversation time, his class giving time to challenge different opponents. And he's known for his different statements, so that the anti-Ram intellectuals, they become Rakshasas, the scientists become opponents, and he wishes to tackle them. And this was a side of Prabhupada that sometimes we sometimes put that side of Prabhupada to the side in order to construct a Prabhupada in which everyone, construct a Prabhupada that everybody would find popular. Because Prabhupada had a lot of harsh criticism for those who held an opinion contrary to the Vedic understanding. And it's really only because Prabhupada did two things. He fanned our spark of interest and love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and at the same time deprecated our loving affection for these anti-Krishna, anti-Ram intellectuals and the so-called leaders of society, whether it be politician, scientist, popular cultural leader, thinker, religionist. Prabhupada had something to say about all of them. And it's only really because he did that the Krishna consciousness movement really got started. If Prabhupada was for everyone and for everything, I really don't think our movement would have prospered at all. We had to, each one of us still today, we have to know what we're for, but we have to know what we're against also, because these, there are forces at work, sometimes undercurrent, sometimes, physiological mode, sometimes a political idea, sometimes a popular cultural idea, that are distinctly opposed to Krishna consciousness. We have to know what they are and how to negate them. Otherwise, we'll get caught up in that ourselves. And we need brave speakers to say, actually, this is rubbish. Actually, we should depose these people from the pecking order in our minds, the intellectual pecking order that's in our mind, whether it be whatever it be, some political idea that we're attached to, or some concept of how just anything really. So part of what we do in a life of Krishna consciousness is to ask ourselves, how am I influenced by counter propaganda? Who's the Rakshasa in my life? Who's eating my brain with their opinion? You may have different conclusions. That's all right, because everybody is different. There may be different Rakshasas for each of us, but at least if you know what Krishna consciousness is, and you know what is debilitating your appreciation for the philosophy intellectually, or for the practice, or for the sense of belonging that you feel, or the sense of community that you'd like to develop, you have to say, what are the obstacles? What are the obstacles? What are the attachments to a particular way of thinking, or particular ideas, or what's preventing us from being, or what's preventing me from being the person that I would like to be? And sometimes, it's the idea that I'd like to be Krishna conscious, but not too much. And many people say that we have many Indian families that say that to their children. You should be a devotee, but not too much. I like you going to the Hare Krishna temple, but not too much. Not too much. You should be a devotee of Krishna. Yes, you should have all respect for Lord Ramachandra. Go to the temple, make a pranam, but not too much. Okay? Not too much. Because too much religion will get in the way of your education. By doing that, you've set up a pecking order, haven't you? The religion, or in this case, devotion to Ram, is important, but it's not as important as passing your exams. That's supreme importance. So let's get this established. Passing your exams is the highest possible achievement for you. After that, it's becoming a doctor. And somewhere maybe fourth or fifth on the line is developing your loving affection for Lord Ramachandra. So I say that you have to call that out, just as Prabhupada is calling this out. And the reason is not because we don't want you to pass your exams and become a doctor, but it's because if you do develop your devotion to Lord Ramachandra, you will be a better student and you'll be a better doctor. How about that as an idea? But spiritually, if you're strong, this will give you a great deal of strength in other areas of your life. The other question I think we have to ask ourselves as devotees is, how are the people that I speak to influenced by the so-called modern Rakshasas? Who's eating their brains? Who's eating up their opinions? How are they coming? Who are the opinion formers that are leaving this community, neighborhood, society, country that I live in a position where they may appreciate Krishna consciousness as one path amongst many others, but don't take it seriously. And they could never take it seriously because this and that. And I think that's where it all begins. That's where there's, like they say, if you go selling something, when selling begins to someone, I'm talking about selling as I cut my teeth in the Krishna consciousness movement selling, whether it was selling books or candles or flowers or more books or record albums or paintings or whatever it is. There was always a black hole of finance that had to be filled. So we, devotees of Krishna, as much as spreading Krishna consciousness, we had to raise funds. So very early on, it was, you learn how to sell something as a devotee, or you don't quite make it. In that way, I suppose we set up our own pecking order. Those were successful salespeople and those who were not. So in selling, the real selling begins, they say, when the person says, no, I don't want what you've got. That's when it really begins. I don't know what, I don't need it, I don't want it. That's when you begin the gentle art of selling. We're all in the business of selling. Every single one of us is in the business of selling something to someone else. Certainly we're in the business of selling ideas. And it doesn't mean banging your fist on the table and shouting. But what it does mean is the gentle art of persuasion, negating opposing arguments. Everyone is in the business of doing this just to have a, human society. So Prabhupada, in this purport here, he says, ask yourself the question, how are you being influenced by counter-propaganda? How can we spread the mission of Krishna consciousness in a world which is influenced by counter-propaganda, even invisible counter-propaganda? He says that we will do this by only accepting the version of the Ramayana which is spoken by Tattvadarshis. Tattva, of course, loose translation is truth. Tattva, ta-twa, tattva, that which is the thatness of something. Thatness, tat-va-twa-ness, the thatness of something. So darshi means that which can be seen. So tattva, for something to be a tattva, for something to be truth, there is no other evidence which can be brought to bear on that statement and change it. No other proof can be raised to change that statement. That's a tattva. We've reached the end of the statement on everything. That's a tattva. So here we're running with the assumption that Brahman, in all its many different forms, Brahman is the tattva, and a tattvadarshi is a person who's seen Brahman. And then Prabhupada refers to this tadviti pranipatena, that pranipat means to bow down, pranipat, pra means going forward, pat means going down, pranipat means to go down and go forward at the same time. What does that look like? If you fall over as going forward, it looks like you're bowing down. So pranipat, to bow down. Pariprashna, prashna means questions. Prashna means a question. So when you've paid your respects to someone, you ask them questions. And pari means all around, like the word perimeter, parimeter, to measure something all the way around. So pariprashna means to ask questions all the way around a subject so that you can understand it. And sevaya, of course, is to serve. Don't just bow down, but actively help the person. And this establishes a real human connection. So Prabhupada says here, sometimes Lord Ramachandra's activities are described in terms of one's own imagination. So there were Ramayans where, as if there weren't so many wonderful descriptions, I will add a few more. I will construct a few more stories. And so people would come up with my version of the Ramayana. Or he says that they are speculations. Well, it could be that Rama's like this. It could be that Lakshman's relationship with Sita was like this. Let's talk about that. And so they would write a Ramayana. These are all material sentiments. Let's try to understand the Ramayana through material sentiments, and that would be there as well. Sometimes we don't like the way a story ends. It's, Ramayana doesn't end in a way that we would hope it would end. It's not a Hollywood ending where everybody laughs or drives off into the sunset. It has what I call a Japanese ending, which is not everybody's happy at the end. Sometimes if you contrast the way a movie is produced in Hollywood and the way a movie is produced or a story is told in the Eastern world, it seems that the Hollywood ending is always the happy ending, and the Eastern ending always gives you more thought. And the thought mainly is, and why did that happen? My wife's relative cousin is a scriptwriter, Hollywood scriptwriter, and he was part of a multi-million pound project to bring a Japanese story to the Hollywood screen using all Hollywood actors. So he wrote the script, and I think the film lost many millions because it was a Japanese story, and international audiences, especially Western audiences, they don't like people dying in the movies, especially when they're meant to be a leading actor. If you're a leading actor, don't kill them off. Anyway, so the idea is that if you change the story, you can make money if it pleases people. And if you don't change the story, you might lose money because not everybody likes the story. But when God comes, the story that he tells through his activities is the story. You don't get to change it. So Prabhupada here is saying a Tattvadarshi doesn't change it. And you cannot add or subtract something from a Tattvadarshis writing. So even at the time of Parikshit, there were different versions. Some versions were crowd pleasers. Some versions were speculative, intellectually speculative. As devotees of in this tradition, we only accept the Sanskrit version written by Valmiki, that is said to be the original version. And Prabhupada concludes by saying, this is a warning by Shukadev Goswami, Rishibhis Tattvadarshibi. Although the Ramayana composed by Valmiki is a huge literature, the same activities are summarized here by Shukadev Goswami in a few verses. So that's what we're going to be hearing in this chapter and the next chapter. Thank you. Hare Krishna. I will conclude here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I see Athena's hand raised.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Dandavat Pranams. Thank you so much for another wonderful session. I have a couple of questions. Trying to figure out which one to ask first. I guess it's interesting as you ask us to think about the modern day Rakshasas, and you give the example of Ravana. And I didn't know this, but what I personally appreciate is that you bring it to, I'm going to say, more practical reality and a little more relatable for us. But I believe you said that in reality, the way we can think about it was Ram was the political kind of leader in the north, and Ravana was the political leader in India. And that makes it a little more like, oh, like modern day or something we can relate to. But it's interesting because when we hear the Ramayana, we automatically think good and bad. Like, how could anyone support the bad person? However, as I think about, say, certain details that are explained, for example, it wasn't Ram that told, was it like Sugriva or someone to learn from Ravana because he's actually a good manager? So perhaps he's a very good leader. And in my mind, how could one support someone so bad? But maybe the way I internalize it is, was Ravana, say, actually a good leader, but he was just personally demoniac. Like, he ate humans, he was lustful, say, willing to kill for his own ego. And in modern, if I could relate it to modern day, would that be, for example, say our current, not current, but presidents, sorry to say, like Bill Clinton. Maybe he was a very good president, but then he was lustful and wasn't loyal to his wife. And then those presidents who put, say, armies in overseas in different countries, that might cause, but in actuality, they might not be like, is that how Ravana was demoniac in those aspects, but was actually a good leader and cared about the people? And I guess I'll wrap it up. I think of Duryodhana, because when the Pandavas were banished, I think Yudhishthira was saying, well, why don't we actually let Duryodhana lead? Because he actually was really good to the citizens, but maybe himself, like, his own, like just personally, he was very demoniac and bad. So how do we actually, I guess, interpret it? Because I think so much in our minds where there's a very clear good and bad, and how could anyone, like Ravana's clearly bad, but is that how I explained it a little more the way to think about Ravana?
A very good question. In England, we have a tradition known as pantomime. And a pantomime is a play, and it's a very colorful play, usually done around, the holiday season. And when the good characters come on stage, everybody knows that they're thoroughly good and they cheer them. And when the bad characters come on stage, everybody knows that they're thoroughly bad and we go boo. And it's not that Ramayana should be reduced, any of the personalities in the Ramayana should be reduced to one-dimensional characters. Ravana is known as a Brahma Rakshasa. Brahma Rakshasa is someone who at one time was a Brahmin, but whose position was gradually eclipsed. The idea is that a Brahmin is like the moon and gradually becomes eclipsed by the shadow that passes over it. And so they lose their qualifications. And in becoming a Brahma Rakshasa, they become an even more clever demonic person than previously. So I'm afraid I don't know the particular examples of the previous life of Ravana. Of course, we know that he was ultimately he's a thoroughly good person, because he's either Jai or Vijay, who fell from the Vaikuntha due to the curse of the four young boy sages. But we keep that in the background. But in the foreground, his current life, I don't know about, not being a Ramayana specialist. But there's usually, in the one-dimensional baddie that we sometimes try to establish as Ravan, there's usually a good person that struggled, fell away, became weak, became occluded by his own lust, and became established as the anti-hero. But in order to, Lord Ram always sees something. He saw something good in Ravana, because of course he came back to Dhanushkoti in present-day Tamil Nadu and established a shrine and worshipped at that shrine to appease for the killing of a Brahmin, if I'm not mistaken. So that place is still there. So Lord Rama he saw that he was a Kshatriya, and this was a Brahmin that he had killed, although a demonic Brahmin. There's a very interesting discussion that takes place between Ravana's brother, Vibhishan, and he looks with horror at what his brother Ravana is doing and says, you can't behave like this. This is not what I signed up for. I'm your brother. I love you, but I'm out. I can't take this anymore. So he goes to Lord Ramachandra. The first person he meets is Hanuman and the monkey men warriors. And of course they say, well, you're a spy. You can't join us. You're a spy. You're from a demonic family. Look who your brother is. You have all these qualities. And then there's a whole tussle in the Ramayana itself about how, this struggle for good over the evil tendencies that we all have within ourselves. Is a very wonderful conversation takes place there. And ultimately, of course, Vibhishan is accepted by Lord Rama. And which proves that there could be at any time sort of restitution for Ravana. At any point, if Ravana had just said, Dasosmi, I submit to you, I really did something wrong. I stole your wife, I did this, I'm a thoroughly bad man, please accept me as your servant. There would have been a possibility, but not a very strong possibility, that Ram would have said yes. because he said the same thing to Vibhishan. He said, if someone comes to me and says, I surrender to you, then from that moment I protect him. So the interesting thing about Ramayana is that there is more absolute goods and absolute bads presented in the Ramayana. However, when we come to Mahabharata, which is the other itihasa, which is very important for cultural and moral leadership development within society based on these shastras. In the Mahabharata, we find a lot more gray areas. Where the Ramayana is very clear, we find gray areas in the Mahabharata. We're not too sure who's good and who's bad anymore. Is Bhishma, who tolerated Draupadi being insulted and yet was a devotee, is he good? Is he bad? Karna, who was rejected in his childhood. He was put in a basket and sent down river, and he fights against the Pandavas, who are devotees of Krishna, but he himself he's sort of from the same mother. So, what's his position? Is he good? Is he bad? So Mahabharata doesn't quite allow us to enter into the sort of pantomime characterization of thoroughly good character and thoroughly bad character. It asks us to consider the origins of Shikandin. Shikandin, was he stroke she a good person or a bad person? So our morality is, with Mahabharata, our morality is tested a little bit more. We're made to think a little bit more. Whereas with Ramayana, it's more projected to us. This is the way to behave, and this is the way not to behave. So the characters in the Ramayana are sort of more strongly good and bad. But even then, there's distinctions within it. But anyway, it's good discussion.
Thank you so much. Oh, am I able to launch into my second question, or I'm not? I didn't check the chat if there's other.
I don't make the rules. I'm not at the top of the pecking order.
Garshwan Prabhu, am I able to please ask my second question?
I see Rupachandra Prabhu is also raised his hand. If he goes, and then you can go.
We'll come back
Thank
to
you.
you.
Hare Krishna, Dandavat
Hare
Thomas
Krishna.
Prabhu. Thank you very much for your class. I really appreciate how you liken Rakshasas to eating our brains. That's very, I like that interpretation. Also, how you highlight.
Listen, I'm not even a conspiracy theorist.
That's really, really nice. Brings new
Yeah.
light into how Prabhupada how he used the word Rakshasa. Also,
Yes,
how you use the word, how you brought up the many other versions of Ramayana, because like right now in the schools and colleges, in the studies of Hinduism, there's an effort by scholars, like the books like many Ramayanas, 101 Ramayanas written by scholars to dilute the authority of the Valmiki Ramayana. But having said that, we also see that in our own tradition, like Mahaprabhu quotes, he brings up the instance of, he explains the instance of Sita's kidnapping, by bringing in new knowledge from another text, which is not Valmiki Ramayana. And also we see in South India, many of the Vaishnavas, they use Kamba Ramayana, which is, I think, composed around 12th century. And the Kamba Ramayana is a Tamil version of the Ramayana. And the story is that the poet Kamba, there was a lot of controversy when he composed it. So he offered it to the Lord to see if it's acceptable. And the Lord actually, I think he put his garland. The deity actually dropped the garland on the Ramayana or something like that to show that it is authoritative. So we have these other versions which are also given a nod by Vaishnava traditions. So how do we reconcile both?
Yeah. Firstly, within our own tradition, within the Gaudiya discussions, we have an understanding that, yes, Sita was never captured because no one can capture the the associate of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as Leela. However, Ramayana doesn't work unless Sita is captured by Ravana. If it's all Leela, then you can't read the Ramayana. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spoke to the gentleman who was so distressed that Sita had been captured. And in order to relieve his distress, he said, well, look, just consider it from this point of view that no one can actually capture Sita. However, that was to a specific conversation to a specific person in circumstances in which, to alleviate his distress, which is the compassion of Mahaprabhu, his job is to alleviate the compassion, to alleviate the distress of others. But it's not for every single ISKCON devotee, when reading Ramayana, to then suddenly be thinking, well, all of this is Leela, all of this is simply like, it's all false. We can't, because then how can you enter into the mood of the Ramayana? How can you actually take it seriously? So I think we sometimes we overdo that, and sometimes I'm trying to give a class on the Ramayana, and the newest devotee in the room is already putting their hand up when I get to the part about Sita being captured by Ravana, and then the newest bhakta is looking very joyful. He knows something that I don't. He's already trying to correct me that actually Sita was never captured. Isn't that true, Kripamoya? And I would say, yes, that is true, but consider what we're doing here. We're having a Ramayana recitation, and so both things, the definition of intelligence is that you can hold both ideas which seem to be contravening each other at the same time.
Ice, almond milk, latte, light on the milk.
So, then the other aspect, of course, is that sometimes Ramayana is written in different languages. It could be a Tattvadarshi Ramayana, which is put into Tamil. It could be another version, just like we have Srimad Bhagavatam, which has been put into English for us. And no one would say that, the English version of the Srimad Bhagavatam by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami is not real. It's not the real version, because the real Bhagavatam is Sanskrit. So A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami's version is in English. So how can that be bona fide? Or if you take Prabhupada's English version and you translate it into Japanese, and all the Japanese devotees are incredibly delighted that now we finally have a version of Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita in Japanese. And I come as a disciple of Prabhupada, and then I look at the Japanese version and I say, I'm sorry, this is not bona fide. Prabhupada did not write this. I can categorically say 100% Prabhupada did not write in Japanese. So therefore, this book is bogus. It's unbona. You can't say that. So because you can have a Tattvadarshi scripture, which is completely authentic, translate it to another language, and have it blessed by the god or goddess of that particular region, and it's still a valid Shastra which will bring you to Ram. Or you can have something which is been rewritten and subject to material sentiments or speculation or imagination, and it won't lead you to Ram, or it will lead you to Ram only partially. So there's a distinction there. And I've never read the Kamban Ramayana, so I don't know.
Thank you very much for this very, very satisfying answer. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Athena, would you like to go?
Yes, thank you so much. As a quick comment, Kripamoya Prabhu, your last statement made me remember or think of when you speak to, for example, Muslims, you can argue, oh, the Quran is so so I'm gonna say small in comparison, but they'll say this isn't, there are many prophets. There weren't just one prophet. There are prophets all over the world. So if you were to actually have followed the lives of the other prophets, it's not to say that it's not Tartvadarshi. They're also relevant, not just because it's not specific Prophet Muhammad. That's a comment. I don't know if you agree with that. But my question is, this
Our
goes back.
problem, our problem is that Muhammad was not a Tattvadarshi. That's the main problem. And therefore what he speaks is not Tattva. Simply putting the word prophet in before someone's name doesn't mean that it is so. Because we can put the name prophet in front of your name, or any of you, we can put the word prophet. It doesn't mean that it is actually so.
Are you saying then you don't believe any of the prophets?
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, like Moses, Jesus, and in the Abrahamic, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad were all prophets. I just want to be clear. Are you saying just specific Muhammad, or all of them you don't believe are Tarshis?
Well, you have to see to which Prabhupada said, give me the Bible, I will show you Krishna. You have to see to what extent Tattva was established. Prabhupada said two different things. Sometimes he would compliment various communities by saying, yes, your book is also Shastra, give it to me, I will show you Krishna. He said that Hazrat Muhammad was a great man who spread God consciousness all over the world. So there are many such statements. But for our discretionary reading, we have to see that, chapter 4, verse 34 of Bhagavad Gita, as quoted in this purport, is Tadvidi Pranipatena, how to approach the Guru. And chapter 4, verse 34 in the Quran is how to beat your wife. So we have to see there's a comparison between the different tattvas. My point is that you have to see what is the measuring stick that you're using to understand whether something is actually tattva or not.
Thank you.
It can't all be relative. There has to be an absolute somewhere.
I'm not to launch into, well, it's interesting first because my second question was related in one sense to the Shakti Vesha avatars, and Satyaresh Prabhu in his Holy Grail of India has a section on the avatars of Vishnu, and he also puts Jesus Christ and Prophet Muhammad. And I have actually brought up this question of how, when you read, I would say our Shastra, women are so respected and seen as mother, and there's no even possibility of ever saying, quote unquote, like hitting the woman, and that has come in discussions with other devotees. But if you were to actually talk to a Muslim and their explanation of it, it's not beating, and this isn't going to go into like a Quran kind of Shastra, but it's understanding the right interpretation. And my understanding is, if after all the discussions and she's out frolicking with other men and isn't obedient to the husband, isn't doing her duties properly, then you take like a spoon size or chopstick size thing and you slap her on the back of the hand like you would a child. So of course I'm not a scholar, but in having discussions, it's not saying it's okay to beat your wife, but it's kind of how they actually properly understand, or what the actual saying it. My point is, we can read it and say, it's like, oh my gosh, the Quran is saying you can beat women. And then if you actually talk to an actual Muslim, they're like, no, that's not the case. What they're actually saying is, after all the attempts, et cetera, you take it's not even supposed to hurt. It cannot leave any marks. So it seems like maybe, and I'm not here to, like, I'm not a Quran scholar, but maybe a modern day women are more degraded. After the Kurukshetra, when that was Arjuna's worry, that women wouldn't be protected, they become degraded, foundations of homes would fall apart. And given that this is the quote unquote new revelation in Kali Yuga, that's how you are to properly, I don't want to say deal, but work with a woman or a wife who is not a proper dutifully doing her or who's like cheating on you and frolicking. So, and of course, as we say, we cannot read our Shastra by ourselves. We must read it under a guru. And my understanding is that if we just read it point blank, we could very much misunderstand what the Shastra is actually saying. So if you go to an imam, if you go to someone who's in the faith, they can properly explain what they actually mean. And it's in no way saying they don't respect women, in no way is beating okay.
It's possible to find someone who would tell you that, yes.
Thank you. Well, this was my my original question, which was dealing with Shakti Vaishya avatars, and you talk about modern day Rakshasas, and I've always thought that Shakti Vaishya avatars must be pure devotees, because it is a special empowerment from Krishna. And you hear, for example, Buddha, Jesus Christ, Prophet Muhammad, and in CC and Madhya, they talk about how Lord Brahma is a Shakti Vaishya avatar. He's a jiva, but he's especially empowered to create the universes. And it's interesting, though, because the question is, well, not every Lord Brahma is a pure devotee. Lord Brahma in this universe is, but you know that other Lord Brahmas who are not, yet they are Shakti Vaishya avatars because they are empowered to have this ability to create material universes. So when I had asked that question, it's interesting, one had quoted Srila Prabhupada, I believe in a lecture or in a letter, said that Hitler is actually a Shakti Vaishya avatar, because for one to have that much power to influence an entire country, almost brainwash like a modern day Rakshasa, killing, the Jews, means that he must have been empowered. If you go along that route that even Prabhupada had said that, and again, not to say it's like, how could such horrible things happen in this world? We know it's the material world, but that means Krishna specifically empowered Hitler, and he was given this special energy as a Shakti Vaishya avatar. So how could Krishna empower such a person to do horrendous activities? Because that means he was specifically endowed with this special Shakti. Do you mind commenting on that? Thank you so much.
Well, the idea of Shakti has to be understood. And the idea of Shakti Avesh has to be understood, and the idea of avatar has to be understood. The Shakti means power of any kind. Ultimately, all power can be traced back to the Supreme Powerful. Parasha Shakti Vivadaiva Shruyate, all power comes from the Supreme Brahman, who is Bhagavan, ultimately. And so anyone who has any power to do anything is demonstrating their own limited Shakti. So a tiger has Shakti, you have Shakti, I have Shakti, and it's all relative to other Shaktis that are being displayed by others. So that's the first thing. Second thing is we get Shakti in 6 different ways: beauty, fame, wealth, power, longevity of life, intellectual power. These all come from previous Sukriti, or different types of activities that we perform, whereby we can be given various powers that will propel us into a particular station in life, in this life. Avesh means one who is immersed in. Avesh is like when you jump in a swimming pool, you're water Avesh. You're completely surrounded by that particular element. So Shakti Avesh means when you're completely surrounded by Shakti. However, it's not just one type of Shakti. You can be little Shakti Avesh, or you can be Maha Shakti Avesh. There's a Shakti Avesh, hierarchy. There's a hierarchy in all things. And avatar means, avatara means one who comes down, that which descends from above. So in the sense that Shakti always comes from above, it is possible to say that Hitler was graced with Shakti to do what he did, or Muhammad was graced with Shakti. But it doesn't place a person as an avatar of Godhead to say that this person's Shakti was so uniquely required by that point in history that God himself endowed that person with not only the Shakti to be a horrible monster, but to create something good for the people. Usually when you say avatar, we're looking for two symptoms. One is paritranaya sadhunam and vanashaya chadushkritam, lifting up the good people and annihilating the bad. So if we say, oh, Hitler was a Shakti Avesh avatar because he was an avatar, therefore we can look to his activities. Let's just have a look. Let's just have a look and see all the good that he did. I don't think you'll find very much. Maybe he was a painter. Maybe he served his country in a particular way. But there's an awful lot of bad. In that sense, Ravana is also a Shakti Avesh avatar because he's come down from Vaikuntha. He has a lot of Shakti to do a lot of bad things, and you can rank him in that way. But actually he's opposed to the supreme person. Therefore his avatarship is completely, limited to the fact that he's using borrowed power to do bad deeds. So in that sense, but sometimes the words Shaktivesh avatar are seen as in a way to elevate a person to a particular status that we honor. And sometimes Prabhupada would do this. Sometimes he would call out Rakshasas, and sometimes he would say, but, let's see, the Shaktivesh avatar, in order to do everything, all the things that they did on the earth for that particular time. At other times, for instance, Prabhupada would say of Muhammad that the whole of Islam is meant for desert dwellers. He said, unless, he said, particular things like do not have sex with your sister or your mother. He said these things were going on. Why did he say it? So therefore, he's sort of saying about the Quran, he's relegating it to merely being a book for people who were, should we say, at the low end of human civilization. On other occasions, on a preaching platform, he's speaking to people as if we should give all due reverence and all due respect to this person, because what did he do? He introduced God consciousness. So it's possible to look at everything that a person does and on the highly elevated scale to say they did something so wonderful, they did something and they did it with God's power, and to look at other things that he did or said and to say, but we must draw this out. The same thing happens with Christianity. There are some statements by Prabhupada about Lord Jesus Christ, and then there's other statements that balance that up. So it's a question of finding the balance between the statements and finding what Prabhupada said in certain given circumstances to certain audiences in order to help them move forward. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you so much for such an elaborate explanation.
We could talk unlimitedly, but it's given a different audience. Yes, I myself would speak very differently. Given a Bhagavatam audience, we must deal with, or at least try to deal with tattva.
Yes, understood. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Kripamoya Prabhu, for taking your time and answering all the questions, and also for a beautiful lecture. His gives Kripamoya Prabhu ki jai, Srila Prabhu.
Jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Bhagavatam ki jai. Hare Krishna.
And so, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you everybody for coming and staying. How
Thank you.
wonderful.